Howdy bubs and welcome back. Today we're jumping back into GameMaker and we're going to take a look at the next part of making Breakout. So currently all we've got are the balls bouncing around the screen. They have collisions with the edges of the screen as well as with the player. But let's go ahead and start working on adding in those blocks that the balls will bounce into and destroy. So today we're going to be making the blocks and making a block manager object. In addition to that are all of the sprites that you would need for your different blocks. So let's go ahead and close this and take a look at the sprites that I've created. I simply created 3 sprites for the blocks, one white, one red, and one blue. Notice I put the origin in the center. This is relevant. The origin will define how the block manager ends up referencing it. I only have one frame. You can get creative with the different blocks you use. Again, your game, your choice. Work around with how you want your sprites to look. So let's go ahead and jump into creating a brand new object. This object is going to be obj_block. I'm going to add in a few different bits of code. Again, depending on how you want to do it, you can modify this, but the basic thing we're going to have is our create event. Here, I'm going to have our create event choose color. So whenever the block's first line of code is run, I don't currently have a sprite selected. Let me select just the white sprite. We choose a color, so we're going to have sprite_index is going to be equal to choose, and I'm going to specify I'm either going to use spr_block blue, spr_block red, or spr_block white. Again, if you have more options, you'll have more than just this line of code. But with this, I can go ahead and throw these into my room, and I'm going to show you a convenient little shortcut here. So I want to throw down multiple of these blocks down. This would take a lot of time if I simply clicked and drag. Instead, I can select which object I want to duplicate, hold down the Alt key on my keyboard, and I can left click and drag. And so with this, I can make, I accidentally messed up that last one. I can make 3 rows here. I think I accidentally made a couple of extra ones. And so now we have a nice little collection here. We're going to end up changing this by the end of the video, but for the time being, just so we can see what is happening, we have 3 rows of 2, 4, 6, 8 blocks. If I were to run my game right now, we'll see that the blocks are there, but there's no interaction. It does randomly choose between the 3 different colors, and so that is successfully working. Now if I create several different balls, they bounce around the screen, but there's nothing going on. Let's go ahead and fix that. Jumping into our ball code for our ball object, we do have collisions with the player. We're going to want to take this same code, so I'm going to actually copy and paste it and create a new object, or sorry, not a new object, new collision with our block object. And so in here, we're going to have a collision with block. And I'm going to, of course, modify this code to be obj_block. And throw this here, here, and here. Now we have our collisions with a block, so it'll bounce off of the block. Let's go ahead and look at that, see if it is working. Again, you always want to test as you do small changes at a time. So let me make several of these, move around. It looks like there is collision working. All right, progress. But if you remember, for those of you that have played Breakout before, whenever the balls are bouncing around and make contact with a block, generally the block gets deleted. Let's learn a new function. So here in our ball code with a collision with a block, I want to tell it after it collides and it determines it needs to change direction and speed. We want to also tell it with other being the thing that we have just collided with. In this case, in reference to the ball, the other thing is the block. I want to delete it. Instance underscore destroy. So now if you hover over other, it actually tells you in respect to what we're looking at what the other thing is. In this case, the other thing in this context is the block. So now whenever I run the code, I make several of these, release them, they now perfectly run into and delete them as they make contact. Now we have a nice little interaction between the blocks and the ball. But if we leave it at just this, the game's kind of stale. And on top of that, I don't want to have to manually draw out the blocks every single time. There's a way to improve the code that we have just written and restructure components of how we've done the game now. So let's go ahead and create a new object. I'm going to call this obj underscore manager underscore block. This is going to be an object just like any of the other ones, except this time I'm not going to have any sprite. No sprite needs to be attached to this because this is not necessary for us to actually look at all. What we need to do here is in our create event, it's going to do one thing for the time being. Later on, we'll probably use this for a few other objects and management, but the key thing here is by having a manager object, something in charge of other things, we can simplify how much code goes into one object by having something else manage multiple objects. So this is going to create rows of blocks. So we want to keep track of, let's say, how many blocks there are per row. Let's create a variable for that. Blocks per row. And we can say, let's do 8 to match what we've done before. Then after we've gotten that, how many rows do we want? Rows. And just to show something slightly different, let's do 5. So now I have how many blocks I want per row, how many rows I want to have. Let's go ahead and then tell it to create these blocks. We've already done creation code before whenever we created the ball object for whenever the player hits the space bar, but we want to have this slightly more coordinated. So I'm going to create a for loop. So in here we can go ahead and do for var I is equal to 0 while I is less than, and then how many times are we going to create, in this case, rows. So this will actually just be for var I is less than rows, I++. So now this will create, in our case, 5 rows. But 5 rows of what? We can then here do another for loop. For var j is equal to 0, while j is less than, in this case, blocks per row, j++. We have here a nested for loop. We have the outer for loop, which tells us to create a row, and the inner for loop, which will actually go through the process of creating each individual row. The outer one will repeat how many times you specified. In this case, it says 5. And then this inner one will repeat how many times this is specified, which in the case is 8. So now, how do we create the individual block? If we look over at the sprites, all of their origin point is in the middle. So whenever they are placed next to each other, we have to specify this central point for defining where we want it to start. In this case, we can actually see the position is specified here. So this looks good enough, I'm going to specify the same spot, X as 256 and Y as 160. So going back into our code, we're going to do instance underscore create layer and specify, I'm going to expand this to make it easier to look at, first our X and Y position. So I just said 256 is a good starting spot, and I believe 160 was the other one. Let me double check that. This is 256 and 160. Yep, that looks good. So that specifies our position. Next is our layer. If we go back into the room, over here we do have 3 layers. There's the instance layer, which currently has the player, and all the balls will appear, as well as all of these blocks. I do not want to have all of these blocks in the same layer. It will make some things a little bit more complicated to keep track of on the occasion, so I'm going to specify a separate layer here. So I'm going to specify a separate instance layer. Let me rename this one to be blocks. Rename the original one to be player. And let's go ahead and just rename this one to be tiles. Now that we've got all of that situated, let's go back into our code. What layer are we going to do it in? In the blocks layer. Blocks. Make sure you put the quotation marks around it to specify the string name for the layer. It'll place it in the correct location. Now that I have that, the next part is, what are we placing here? Well, it's simple. Our obj underscore block is going to appear right here. So this basic outline will create for us one block. Since it's in this for loop that runs 8 times, it'll do this thing 8 times. Since it's inside of this other for loop which runs 5 times, it'll do 5 times 8, so it will create 40 blocks. Let's throw this into the room, then run it. So now we see there's only one block, but in reality there's actually 40 blocks all stacked on top of each other in this one spot. That is not how we wanted this to work. We wanted it to build it out across the, in my case, 5 rows of 8 blocks. So we're going to go back in here and modify this slightly. While this is our starting position, let's go ahead and define some helper variables here for where our position is. And so x start is equal to 256 and y start is equal to 160. I'm going to replace these 2 variables. Now, as we move through this, x start is going to be added to based off of our current block position. It's going to be j times and the distance between each block. So the width of our blocks. In my case, if I go back to my sprite, my width of the block is 128 pixels. So whenever I specify here j times some number, my width of my block is 128. So I'm going to do 128. You can, of course, modify this as needed. For our y start, we're going to do a similar thing, but instead referencing I, or the row we're currently in. So plus I times, and then our height. Going back to my sprite, the height of the sprite is 32 pixels. So over here, I'm going to specify 32. Now let's run this and see if it works. There we go. I now have 2, 4, 6, 8 blocks in a row and 5 rows of it. And this was all done using code rather than manually placing things down. This can be very convenient if, rather than it running only once, let's change this to instead be change event to be a key pressed event. Let's say if I press enter, this will create a new row of blocks. Let's hit run. So nothing's there. I press enter. I have my row of blocks. I can then have the balls bounce into all of them, get everything deleted. And I can press enter again to create a new set of blocks. This now creates for us something very convenient and easy that we can play around with to build out our game. This is just a basic structure here that'll be very useful. Your challenge is to play around with this, modify your values, create your different sprites, so that way you can have things situated the way looks best for your game. If you have any questions or need any assistance, just let me know in class. Otherwise, that's all I've got. Everyone, have a good one. I just wanted to say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Shout out to my bad bubs, my top 5, my day ones. Y'all have always been there for me. Next up, my baby bubs, the next 5. I always love y'all's support. And finally, for everyone else, any little bit helps. Thank you to all my basic bubs for supporting me along my journey. If you want to continue receiving notifications, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell button.